You're listening to TBR Radio Presents, the Dixie Heritage Hour, with your host, the Director of Dixie Heritage, Dr. Ed DeVries.
Our guest on today's TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour is Paul Angel. Our regular listeners know Paul is the executive editor of the Barnes Review magazine. And of course, he's here to discuss with us the upcoming March and April issue of TBR magazine, which, by the way, today became available online at the barnesreview.org website. So let's go straight into our interview with Paul Angel. The cover on this March-April issue of the Barnes Review magazine, of course, is Rommel in defense of the Desert Fox. But as I read through the issue, I noticed that there were probably at least 3 articles that could have been the cover story. How did you come upon Rommel as the determination of the cover?
We did have a lot of great articles in this one. Rommel's of great interest to people. He's always been extremely popular whenever we sell a book. We had never placed him on a cover before, and this was an interesting angle. For instance, we're saying we're in defense of the Desert Fox. We're proving that Rommel was not a traitor and that he was not involved in the plot to kill Hitler. Whereas, of course, the mainstream thinks he is a hero because he was involved in the plot to kill Hitler. So it's a little bit different from what the mainstream is going to portray about Erwin Rommel. Rommel is well respected in the West. You've seen movies about him. He's usually not portrayed as one of the evil Nazis. And that's all because of the myth, at least according to my author, John Weir, that Rommel was not involved in the plot to kill Hitler. And it was all, he was framed. Some of the people they tortured or beaten or threatened, some of the officers named Rommel in the plot to assassinate Hitler. But according to John Weir, he had nothing to do with it. If Rommel had been proven earlier to have been framed, well, he wouldn't be a hero in the West because he wouldn't have been involved in the plot to kill Hitler. So as you well know, Stauffenberg, according to the mainstream, is some great hero, right? They made a movie about him because he was heavily involved, obviously one of the main players in the plot to assassinate Hitler. So it's kind of funny. We think he's a hero because he wasn't involved in the plot to kill Hitler, and the mainstream thinks just the opposite. But you know as well as I do, Rommel was a pretty savvy military leader. Here is World War I career. He was highly decorated, brave guy, courageous guy. But he did have his conflicts with Hitler. At some point in time, I believe Rommel had approached Hitler and said, we need to make peace or figure out a way to get out of this. And Hitler ordered him out of the room on multiple occasions. And so I think that they had banged heads a few times. Hitler was obviously was an optimist about the way the war might end. I think he thought to the very end that the Brits and the Americans would finally see the light, that the Soviet Union was the real menace to the world. They never did. And of course, Rommel went all over the place, right? His tactics are still studied today from his North African campaigns. And again, he was a very successful World War I officer. He was placed in charge of the Atlantic Defense Wall, right? That was put in place by the Germans to prevent against D-Day. His own family, his son had been fought for many years after his death to try to correct the historical misinterpretation and defamation of his father's character. But I think his wife and others had encouraged him not to commit suicide, right? The story was Hitler came to him, knew he was a national hero, was convinced he was involved in the plot to assassinate Hitler. And Hitler gave him his choice. You know, you can either defend yourself in court or you can kill yourself. And so I think he probably thought that the deck was stacked against him at that particular point in time, since they were going to trot out some of these German officers who had been involved in the plot and had named Rommel. And so I think he just thought it was the honorable thing to do to kill himself. And so I believe he took poison, correct, down the street a few blocks away and ended up killing himself. And he was given, if you look at the German response, I mean, he was given a state funeral, right? And the thousands and thousands of people came to the funeral, and it was just a well-beloved man. And I'm not exactly sure how that would have played out in court. But yeah, Rommel was our cover because we felt it was time for him to appear on the cover, and especially from a new, fresh angle.
I know Rommel has always been someone who I've been personally fascinated with, at least, in my study of World War II. And I, in reading that article, one of the reasons I'm glad that it was printed is because I've always struggled with the fact that Rommel was part of that plot to assassinate Hitler. And the reason why is because it just seemed so inconsistent with the rest of his character and the rest of his career. And so now I don't have to reconcile that anymore. I can dismiss it.
Yes, I think so. He was a loyal military leader whose greatest concern was his nation. I don't think that there's really many bad things you could say about Rommel.
In the beginning of the magazine, even before the Rommel story, of course, is your editorial, beating the fake news tom-tom of hate, and you were commenting on everything that happened that I guess you could just call the travesty that happened to those poor high school kids from Covington, Kentucky.
Well, they made two big mistakes, right? They were white and they were Christian. That's not a good combination these days. But if anybody is listening is unfamiliar with the story, of course, this was kids from the Covington Catholic Church in Kentucky, and they showed up to the nation's capital to march in a pro-life rally, anti-abortion rally, an anti-infanticide rally. They were confronted by this Indian banging his tom-tom, and Indians, of course, are always fussing that they've been mistreated and such. It turned out that immediately, of course, I should say that in the background was this weird black Israelite, Hebrew Israelites, right, who I guess they think they're the true Israelites of the Bible. But they're a violent group, and they certainly will attack. And they say hateful things. I mean, they can really commit hate crimes. They're calling these kids crackers and faggots and incest kids and all this other stuff. And, of course, the mainstream media is just sitting, waiting on anything they can do to agitate and create to make racial relations in this country even worse than they are. They've done a better job. As Mike Piper always used to say, they're the worst hate mongers there are. They misinterpreted this, either purposely so or by accident, most likely on purpose, because there's, like I said, anything they can hear, or they see that they can twist into white hatred that doesn't exist, fake hate. But anyway, yeah, the headline was beating the fake news tom-tom of hate. Well, the Indian had been banging that tom-tom right up against that young man's face as he stood there. And, of course, the media turned that into them. I guess they took the comments of the black Hebrew Israelites, which were also racist against the American Indians, attributed them to these white Catholic kids, specifically the one kid. I'm looking for his name. I can't remember it off the top of my head.
His last name was Sandman. I cannot remember his first name.
There you go. And, of course, it turned out, well, they said this brave Indian Marine who served in Vietnam was being vilified by these evil white children. And, man, everybody jumped on top of it. I'm talking they not only in the mainstream news media, but every type of Hollywood actor, starlet, whoever they are, comedians. And, well, it turned out that the mainstream was completely wrong. And even after seeing the video footage, which showed this, I think his name was Nick, right? Nicholas Sandman, listening respectfully to this Indian as this tom-tom was being beaten in his face, refused to get mad, trying to diffuse the situation, which is amazing for a young teen, right? To be able to have such poise in public. Well, they twisted around, and before you knew it, he was screaming epithets at the Indian and they discriminated against him. What they didn't tell you was all the things that they got wrong about the story. Of course, when they saw the video footage, the mainstream media still wouldn't print a retraction. They just would say, almost in unison, Ed, as you looked at these different reports, they all said the same exact thing from CNN to ABC to NBC, which just shows you how cookie-cutter the mainstream media news is, that there was a slightly more complicated scene that happened. They didn't really come out and say, we were wrong. This child behaved like a grown man. Even though, as I said, he was a young teen, that he was nearly personally diffusing this very raucous situation and instigated by these black Hebrew Israelite strangers. They defamed the kid. Everywhere, his family started getting the death threats, his mother, his father, himself, his school, even his own, like some of the Catholic bishops were jumping on the bandwagon. Oh, we can't believe our kids would act so horrible. Well, nearly ruined the kid. Well, he's gotten a lawyer, and the multiple lawyers volunteered to represent the children, specifically Sandman, because he was the center of this particular event, delivered letters to the Washington Post, and they want to sue them for $250 million for defamation of character. I don't think the kid's interested in money, but the ruination of his family and his school and his classmates and his own reputation is unbelievable.
Well, the lawyer picked that amount, $250 million, because that's the amount that Jeff Bezos paid to buy the paper.
Well, there you go. But anyway, that being said, turned out that Nathan Phillips wasn't a Marine. He wasn't in Vietnam, as far as I know. It was Phillips, the Indian, who had began this confrontation. It was the black Hebrew Israelites who were screaming all kinds of stuff that would be considered hate crimes if they had been white. And despite the fact that the controlled media, as I say here, which thrives on inventing hate crimes and then reporting them as the exclusive bailiwick of white people, never even bothered to apologize for duping the public yet again. And of course, if you see, how the American public is also, especially a large portion of the white public, is so guilt-ridden, unnecessarily so and unrightfully so, but still they are. White people are pathologically altruistic, as we say, that they're jumping on this whole bandwagon, and they want to just put this story out there, and it's never been retracted, and you still see stories out there that this kid's at fault. And anyway, they've delivered requests for retraction to all kinds of comedians, and this is what should happen to the media, because the media is a bunch of fake news purveyors. That's what they are today. I think, and I stick up a little bit for Fox, only because they try to correct some of the conservative lies about conservatives, but they're nearly just as bad as all the rest of them. But it just goes to show you they don't bother to get the facts before reporting what they call news. And the reason is because it's all emotional. They just want to rile up the public and make it think that white people hate every single person in this country that's not white. It's absolutely ridiculous. I mean, as I always say, that white people have bent over backwards for every group that's ever come in here to make life better for them, to pay their appalling social bills, to help them get through life. We welcome people as best as we can. And when we resist, for instance, say relocating 10,000 Somalis to a county that only has 15,000 people in it, and when we resist something like this, we're immediately branded genetic racist haters. It's just so much baloney. But behind it all, as the owners, of course, of the mainstream news media, you have to think that they have some ulterior motive, some agenda here to, and not to overstate the case, but to wipe us out, to make us so politically disempowered that we have no way of defending ourselves, so that no matter when we finally explain why we might resist having 27 mosques put into take the place of 27 churches in a small southern town or wherever it may be, in a small southern county or state, that it's all because we're racist. It's just because we are the ones who started the country. We're the ones who've been doing this thing for 200 years. We don't like things to change too quickly, and we understand that this is a Christian country, and it will be as long as it, well, I don't know how much longer that's going to be, but that things work best as they are, and we're not ready for radical change, especially change that culturally and religiously affects the who and what we are, which isn't haters, obviously. It's, as I say, we generally embrace people from different cultures in different countries and try to make life as easy for them as possible here and make them feel as welcome as possible. But how could you turn this altruism that we show around into such an unbelievable story as this story of?
Well, another application of that, even beyond the fake news, is just fake media in general, and what the media is doing, not just your television newscasts, be they CNN, CBS News, ABC News, NBC News, your mainstream publishing houses as well, the History Channel and so forth. The media's dealing of history, they're putting out just as much fake history as they're putting out fake news. And that's why a publication like the Barnes Review is so important, because this fake history machine is making it necessary for us to constantly correct the historical record.
That's absolutely correct. Hollywood, my gosh, Hollywood. Would we miss Hollywood if Hollywood wasn't around? Would we miss some of these publishing houses if they weren't putting out their garbage, the same old thing over and over again? An example might be this, Ed, as far as everybody's into ancestry DNA, right? And they want to know where they came from. So they have this guy, this black guy, professor, what's his name? Louis Gates. I probably have his name wrong. And he's got a show about finding your roots. Well, my wife wanted to watch it one time, and she's got four episodes recorded. I said, why even watch it? It's going to end up being that his ancestor's either a slave owner or a Holocaust survivor or an evil Nazi guard. I mean, it's so predictable now, but people gobble it up. Why does anybody care what Hollywood stars think? I understand, by the way, the good news is the Oscars and such awards programs for Hollywood have had diminishing attendance or viewership over the past few years, to the point where they're starting to get worried about it. Well, maybe the American public isn't as dumb as we think. Maybe they're catching on to this garbage and punishing them by simply turning that stuff off. History Channel, I know they've got their agenda too, but I watch it. But you got to know what you're watching too. You got to know what a lie is, and you got to know what's wrong. And you can pick some good facts and some good history out in between the lines if you read between the lines on this stuff. But nobody does it better. Nobody's got bigger budgets than Hollywood. Nobody can generate the CGI and all this other stuff better, can make anything look like anything. But I would basically say that mainstream media news is Hollywood today. I mean, it's a fictional script that they've all adopted. They all go off the same playbook. Depressing, I would say. But like you say, the good news is that there's a few publications out there, not just the Barnes Review, but a few others out there, who are risking lots to put out the truth, or at least what we think is the truth, based on the facts.
If you love listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, then I know that you'll love reading the Barnes Review. The Barnes Review is one of my favorite magazines. I began reading the Barnes Review long before they became a sponsor here on the program. In the Barnes Review, you will read vignettes of man, from the prehistoric to the very recent, from forgotten races and civilizations to first-person accounts of World War II and the late Cold War. There's just not a more interesting magazine published today, nor a more significant and important subject than real history. So if you'll visit www.barnesreview.org, that's www.barnesreview.org, you can find out how you too can become a subscriber to the Barnes Review. You can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review by mail, or you can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review electronically in PDF editions. Or you can subscribe to receive both. That's what I do. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review. You talk about the Hollywood manufacturing of fake history. I remember when I was a kid, a movie, and I don't know how many times I saw this movie, probably because my dad liked it even more than I did. Dustin Hoffman made a movie called Little Big Man, and it had a mention here in the magazine as well that whole movie, although somehow or another we saw it, but we didn't really see it, maybe because they did such a masterful job of scripting it. But it really was a very anti-white, anti-America, anti-Western expansion piece of propaganda. But I guess we were so mesmerized by Dustin Hoffman's telling of the scripted story that we just overlooked that and watched the movie anyways, again and again and again.
Well, we all look at things from a different point of view and in a different age. I mean, when we're young, of course, we tend to believe whatever our school teachers tell us. It's a rare person at a young age specifically that can discern fact from fiction, because you have to educate yourself. We can jump to that particular topic because that story was the one about the savage Indian, correct?
Yes.
By Tom Goodrich. Now, I got to tell you, Tom Goodrich is one heck of a writer. And this guy doesn't pull any punches. As you mentioned on a radio show before, in a story he did about the firebombing of Tokyo, he tells you blow by blow what's actually happening. If somebody's getting tortured, he's going to tell you how they got tortured. And it is very gripping and will affect you emotionally. Some people even tell me that his stories need to be gone through in segments because they are so disturbing to some extent. But the truth is the truth. In that particular article, he was talking about real savagery of the noble savage that we have today. Remember the famous commercial when we were kids, right? Was the one about the littering, right? You had the Indian there, looked like came from the buffalo-headed nickel. He's crying, right? Because some evil white man threw out a beer bottle or something, right, on that thing. And that's kind of the image we got, this sensitive Indian who was a great caretaker of the land, who would never kill more than just what he needed to eat, who was always fighting off the evil white man who wanted to carry off his women, and all this whole stuff. They even blamed scalping on us back in the day. And what people don't understand is the Indian was a savage fighter. No white man wanted to be captured by the American Indians, because if you were captured alive, you might be skinned from the bottom of your feet all the way up to your head. Slowly and surely you might be, while your skin is being ripped off, you might be being poked with burning sticks by the entire tribe. The kids would come along and get you. The squaws would come along and get you. And of course, they didn't care if you were alive or dead when they scalp you. Now the story was, of course, that we invented scalping, right? We wanted to pay during the French and Indian War and King Philip's War and other things, whatever we were fighting the British, we were fighting with the British against the French in the French and Indian War. But they wanted to show that they had killed the enemy. So we convinced the red men to start scalping people. Well, this is a bunch of baloney, because 100 years before that, in whatever memory that the Indians had, they were scalping each other like crazy. And still the same types of tortures. When they saw us, of course, they did it even worse. If they came across with their Indian enemies, they'd wipe out every single one of them. And they didn't care. Carry off the women, kill some of the children, maybe adopt a few of the kids and make them slaves. The women would be sex slaves, if possible, for the red men. The rest of the men would be killed, tortured, whatever it may be. And of course, this directly flies in the face of what we've been told in movie after movie, that the American Indian was just this kind and wonderful person. On the other side of the coin, TBR has always been against colonialism. And in an article we ran, a point we took that the disease had taken a great toll on the number of people we killed. People took offense to that. It wasn't a purposeful genocide. I mean, disease they really didn't have the immunity for smallpox and to influenza and such. But that being said, it doesn't really matter whether somebody's good or bad if you wipe them out. That's kind of one of those, oops, sorry about that. But the fact of the matter was, the American Indian was of a nature that he was going to fight to the brutal death for what he thought was his. I don't care about his attitude about the land ownership either. But the American Indian was as bad to his own fellow tribes as he was to the white man. And I'll tell you, one of Goodrich's points in that story, especially, this was basically an article discussing Indian warfare on the high plains after the Civil War until about, 1879, I think it was. It was probably the most brutal fighting you may have seen anywhere in the world in world history, in the way that the captives were treated specifically. What can I tell you? As I say, the American Indian was an extremely tough foe and fought to the bitter end, but don't believe what you see in Little Big Man, that's for sure.
Breaker one, might be crazy, but I ain't dumb. Crazy Cooter coming at you. Hey, y'all, got your ears on? Well, I got some news for you. We're here at our brand new Cooters in the Country store in Sperryville, Virginia. Good old Sperryville, where Cooters started many years ago. Folks are coming from all over Hazard County, and we're going to have a grand old time with good music, good food, and best of all, good friends. Hope y'all can be there. Up, here come Enos. Huck got Cletus with her. I'm down and I'm gone.
So Goodrich's point was, when you fight in this is why there's rules to war, and why white culture specifically have always had rules for wars, not targeting civilians, not targeting civilian centers, blah, 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 is that when you fight like that, the white man was also becoming extremely brutal. You always hear about the whites wiping out the village, Well, I'll tell you, when you've seen your own wife and daughter killed, raped, tortured, you lose a bit of your own humanity. And so the fighting on both sides got brutal, very, very brutal. But I think we started off, as we did with Rules of War, and we quickly realized when fighting the American Indian that there really weren't any rules of war, and everything went, and it was a dehumanizing type of thing.
Another connect the dots that I saw in this issue was your editorial on the Covington kids, and it was specifically a war against white Christian America. And then the story on Rommel, specifically that Rommel had come to the conclusion peace had to be pursued diplomatically because he did not see a military option for winning that war for Germany. But Hitler realized that there was never going to be a diplomatic solution. In other words, he realized the Western powers were going to come after Germany until it was extinct. In Hitler's mind, obviously, if we're going to be brought to extinction, we might as well at least have the dignity of fighting to the bitter end. Even when Hitler was dead, the German high command began to realize there was nothing shy of absolute surrender in Germany's future, even with Hitler's death. In other words, they realized that it was not a war against Adolf Hitler, but it was a war against Germany and the German people itself. And then I read the next article, which was an article about sculpture and art in the Third Reich. And you look at the sculptures and you look at the art pieces that were nationally, prominently significant throughout the Third Reich in government buildings and at stadiums and in plazas and so forth. Only a Christian people would have even understood the symbolism of these pieces. Germany was criticized for being that, I guess you could say, too white of a nation anyways. It was also, as you can see in their artwork, a very distinctively Christian nation. And so World War II, if you will, was perhaps the beginning of the attack against white Christian civilization.
Well, that's a very good point. You know, we weren't saints from France and Britain and the United States. But if you look at the common culture we had, and then you look at the Soviets, and many of the Soviet soldiers were Mongols, you know, and atheized, and what they did, the barbarity of that, of the savagery that we saw in the high plains. So it was a dehumanizing or a mongrelizing war of total destruction that broke every single rule from the Soviet side with this idea of rapine, changing the cultural and literally the genetic balance of the West. I think that the Christian nations and believe me, again, if you wanted to make the case that we were no saints either, but you look at like the Stuttgart atrocity. Well, we didn't release on the poor Germans hiding in the subways in Stuttgart the white Christian soldiers. We let loose non-Christian black soldiers of West Africa that were fighting for the French. And so I still think that there's a humanity left, even then in the midst of war, in the West, in a Christian West, that just simply isn't there amongst some of the other religious and racial groups left on the planet at that particular point in time. This is what the West Africans have been doing to each other forever. And this is why I say you got to have rules for war. But when not every nation has rules for war, you end up unimaginable atrocities. By the way, that article was very good. That's by Mike Walsh. And if you see that, it's interesting that when you want to destroy people, right? We know this here. You go after not only their religion, but their culture. And so all these beautiful sculptures by Brecker and by Thorak and multiple numbers of great architects, you destroy their art forms. You destroy their literature. You burn these things. You destroy them. I look at this picture of these statues that are knocked down and they're sitting in somebody's backyard. And after the war, guess they were scared to put them back up, the Germans. And you got ladies hanging their laundry over top of them. But you're looking at not only the sculptures that are massive and the horse and the human in Western culture, and Asian culture as well, obviously not in Africa too much. And it didn't really happen in North America for the American Indian until we gave them the horse and showed them how to ride a horse, and tame a horse. These massive sculptures are not only in they're in these massive architectural edifices and constructions that are in themselves beautiful for containing this stuff. And of course, German art was hearkening back to the Greek and the Roman and early Christian stuff. So as you point out, yes, there's one image in here called the Avenger. And that was by Brecker, in which he's fighting the snake, right? And that harkens back to the St. George slaying the dragon.
Well, the symbolism is obvious because the serpent, of course, represents lies, and the sword represents truth. And of course, the Bible itself refers to itself as the sword of truth, and the serpent was the one in Genesis chapter 3 who came to Eve with the lie.
But a perfect symbol, and here he is. He's got his sword up, getting ready to chop that head right off that thing he grabbed. But this is a long history in Western culture. And you see these things, they just went out of their way to destroy everything they get their hands on. And I'm looking at this one this one sculpture. It was the Workman's Monument. And some Christians might object to, at that particular point in time, the Germans had almost gone back to the Roman and Greek appreciation for the human body. And there was a lot of nudes done at the time, which to some Christians today is a little bit offensive still. As an artist myself, I understood that. But at any rate, that being said, this sculpture is 5 times bigger than this artist. And here he is working on this massive, beautiful thing, every ripple of the muscle, the head and the emotions on the face and everything else. Well, you've got to absolutely just crush that, break that, forget it. And so I don't know who was mostly responsible for this. Were the Allies involved in this or not? I'm not sure we made that point well enough. So, I mean, yeah, they didn't, the Christian symbology and also its ties back was not lost on the people who were destroying this. They didn't really want them to, you would understand that this was a thread that had gone through, an artistic thread that had gone through all the way back to our earliest days of civilization. So crush civilization, crush your artwork, crush your music, crush your literature. I always say the funny thing is, of all the criticisms TBR has gotten for running factual stories and looking at particular incidents in the magazine, that's not what we would get blasted for. We get blasted for running this ad for German marching songs. Well, German marching songs, you think maybe the Nazis, of course, the people are thinking they're kill all the Jews and kill all the West or whatever. It's not what it was. It was like old folk songs that they'd march to, and little things about how beautiful their countryside was, about how beautiful the mountains were, how clean the air was, how wholesome things were. But it was interesting that if the criticism was about the music, it wasn't anything about the facts in the magazine. They just used to blast us for selling German marching songs. And I never could quite understand that until, I got a little more sophisticated about it. And I see a story like this, that they have to crush your culture. Culture, of course, and religion go hand in hand in many countries, obviously.
Extra, read all about it.
If you're like me, and I'll bet you are because you're listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, you like to be on the cutting edge of honest news and accurate information. You like to hear about the latest financial trends and to know what's happening around the world and right here in the United States, the things that can directly impact you, your life, and the life of your family. And if you're like me, you do not rely on the mainstream media to obtain this information because, frankly, you know that you just can't trust them. Fortunately, there is an alternative news outlet with a long-established track record for honesty and integrity, and that is the American Free Press. AFP is the preeminent alternative, independent news source for honest, hard-working, truth-loving Americans. AFP is the antithesis of the controlled, lamestream media. AFP is employee-owned and has been so since its founding. Because of that, AFP never has and never will allow advertisers or special interests or big money to dictate what appears in the pages of the American Free Press newspaper. 26 times a year, the American Free Press newspaper can be delivered to your door, packed with the kind of uncensored news that I know you're going to appreciate. AFP covers the stories and tells the truth that the lamestream media is frankly scared to touch. And AFP offers real, on-the-scene reporting and commentary, the likes of which you will never see in the Washington Post, the New York Times, ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, or just about any other lamestream news source that you can think of. That's right, there's only one national populist news weekly staffed by an unsurpassed team of veteran investigative journalists who will dare to rip the veil off of many of the major news stories that are being censored and suppressed by the big money controlled media monopoly. And that's the American Free Press. AFP publishes exciting, in-depth, uncensored news and information that's grassroots and patriotic, information that Americans need to know in order to combat the growing police state. AFP stands firmly against the New World Order and against those who are working to establish a global plantation under the rule of a powerful few. In short, AFP is your voice. If you have any doubt why they want to silence AFP, you must be relying on the lamestream media for your news, and folks, that's a big mistake. If you're ever dissatisfied with your subscription to the American Free Press, their guarantee is that you just drop them an email and they will gladly refund the unused portion of your subscription. So what are you waiting for? Visit www.americanfreepress.net. Once again, www.americanfreepress.net. And find out about the American Free Press Do it today.
Extra, extra, read all
About
about it.
music and, the aversion to music in the war against the culture. I did not conduct the interview, but here a few weeks ago on TBR Radio, there was an interview with Alison Chablos, and I see here that there's an article in the issue talking about her and her ordeal and having to go to prison, as she said, for music that no one was even forced to listen to.
Alison Chablos is an interesting character, let me tell you. An extremely talented and intelligent woman. She wrote satirical songs and poetry, but she pokes fun, and specifically at Zionists and the Jewish lock on history, as we'll say here from her point of view. And she got herself into some real trouble. And see, what happened was it used to be that you were inciting racial hatred. Now, what happened to her, I think, was in England. And she is a Swiss national, but has spent a lot of her life in England. I hope I got that right, Alison. And that is one thing they hate. People hate to be made fun of more than anything. Forget the facts. All they have to do is when you print facts to say, look, they're nothing but anti-Semites or racists or white supremacists, which is all baloney because these people who write for us are just historians. And you'll see that there's no hatred in what they're writing. But it's easy to dismiss facts by simply saying, oh, they're just racist. But when you make people laugh at some of the stuff, and specifically she was talking about her opinion about what's going on in the Middle East, specifically the Palestinians, some of the massacres that have gone there conducted out by the Israelis, the Israeli supremacism, the Israeli double standard when it comes to life. It's not okay for a terrorist to kill 4 Jews, but it's quite okay for the Jews in Israel to kill 300 Palestinians. They're nothing but, insentient beasts, goyim, whatever they are. But when she started to write these things and kind of make people chuckle a little bit, or when you put it in poetry, it's putting it in an art form that seems to send them into a massive tizzy. That's a nice long interview. Dave Gahary conducted that. He's one of the better interviewers that we have. Asked some very good questions in this. I think it's very worth reading because to see that writing a poem will get you in big trouble. Writing a poem about something poignant, but against the accepted narrative of the court historians, we call them, right, who just regurgitate whatever their masters in academia tell them to, or their sponsors, that you will run afoul. Now, she ended up getting a suspended sentence, and she did appeal recently. That appeal didn't come through before this issue. But here's the thing. We were talking about inciting racial hatred. Kind of now lowered the bar in that they got her for being grossly insensitive to, I guess, specifically Jews. And now we've got a new bar here. The bar is whether or not your feelings are hurt. Now, if you said to me, a white man who was a brutal murderer, I'd object to you. But my feelings necessarily wouldn't be hurt. I would counter you with facts, but not if your feelings are hurt. How do you quantify that? So when did the interpretation of facts go to our emotions?
Well, if you want to talk about hurting people's feelings, and even as absurd as it is, there is a penalty under law for hurting somebody's feelings, but it's a civil penalty, not a criminal penalty. In other words, if you can convince a jury that your feelings were hurt, maybe they'll award you monetary damages. But that's not a criminal proceeding. That's a civil proceeding.
Hey, man, my feelings are hurt every time I see Robert E. Lee's statue defaced or brought down or spray painted upon. But our feelings don't count. I mean, I don't know when it's ever going to get even. It's not going to get even. They're not going to make it even. So I guess American Indians' feelings are hurt when the statue of Juniper Serra is up there and he is ministering to an Indian who might be on the ground and he's giving a blessing from Christ. Okay, but his feelings are super hurt, and then they smash that statue up and haul it away, and my feelings don't count. So we've got to be sensitive to everybody's feelings. But here in the United States, we know we're going to get in trouble from a different way. They're going to cancel your credit card processing. They're going to take away your PayPal. They're going to cancel your bank account. They're going to put you on the hate list, right? But in Europe, man, in a lot of countries, 13 to 17 countries, not sure what, you'll be locked up. Now, Allison did get a suspended sentence. By the way, her story was amazing. After making a few comments, people's feelings were hurt, and they went after her on social media. And she was a singer, and she did cruise ships, And they would call up her employer and tell her what a horrible Holocaust denier and a racist she was, and how insensitive she was, and what an anti-Semite she was. And okay, then the cruise ship would say, sorry, Allison, we got to put you off at the next port because of all this complaint.
Well, what people do not know is if you look at all the major cruise lines, Royal Caribbean, Norwegian, Carnival, Disney Cruise Lines, the CEO of all of the major cruise lines are Jewish.
Really?
You know, you could see where if they received an accusation of somebody being anti-Semitic, they would take that very personal very quickly, whether it was true or not, whether the accusation was true or not.
Right.
You know, the deck was stacked against her working in the cruise industry, obviously.
Yeah, and they hounded her, though. They hounded her. Finally, she went to this, like, the Edinburgh Fringe Festival, where political correctness is supposed to be kind of ignored, right, because it's artistic expression. But unfortunately, she was even too fringe for the Fringe Festival. Anyway, I think...
So is she still performing, or has she moved on to another line of work now, or because of all of this?
Wherever she can perform, she performs, and she's still sticking it out, but she's just been hounded by... It's so funny because she's hounded by social media. They've cost her basically her career, and all for writing poetry in support of Palestinians for the most part, from what I can see. But they'll just hound you. They'll hound you and hound you and hound you, and they'll ruin you. And in her case, I think it was because she was kind of humorous, but she was also very poignant in what she did. And, you know, some revisionists in general have been very critical of her because of that. I always found, as my own experience with the marching songs, as I said, that I found that there's another angle to this besides just putting out the facts, and I think she was hitting it. But she's not particularly, I don't think she's like a revisionist scholar. She's just an artist. She's a musician, a very talented one. And there was just something about that got under their skin. I mean, you know what? Come on, man. What's going on with freedom of speech these days? Well, we know what's going on with freedom of speech. There isn't any. Well, not when you're talking about the wrong subjects. Right. But anyway, I cannot even give that interview justice. It's a lengthy piece in which she just has her say, and we give her forum to say what she pleases, which you ain't going to see in too many places. You know this Quinnell salute, right? That the guy, the black comedian, right? I don't know if I'm saying it right, Diodone, right? And he just puts his hand down and kind of chop at your arm. It's almost like an up yours establishment move. Well, they've turned this into somehow an upside down Hitler salute. Well, if they got a picture of her, she just did that kind of a, hey, up yours, I'm going to go ahead and do my artwork, whether you like it or not. It really wasn't directed at the Jewish community, and she's certainly no National Socialist as far as I know. But, man, that picture got her in humongous trouble. And so it's like crossing the lines there that you can't even do something like an up yours salute. It's the CAA, by the way. And I can't remember what it stands for, but it's a super pro Israel / Jewish lobby in England. But yeah, read that and just see what got her in trouble. I mean, my daughter always says, "What do you laugh at everything for?" I mean, because it's so ridiculous. I mean, what am I going to do? I'm either going to cry or I'm going to laugh at some of this stuff. But I just shake my head.
The North Carolina Heritage Political Action Committee was organized by concerned citizens of North Carolina in 2015 in response to the increased attacks on North Carolina's history and heritage. The North Carolina Heritage PAC supports state and local candidates for public office who pledge and show their support for the protection of Confederate memorials and the preservation of all of North Carolina's history. We all know that Confederate memorials and symbols are the easy targets, and that the end game of our leftist enemies is to erase and rewrite all of history, from the colonies to the War on Terror. If we fight them for our state's rich Confederate history and heritage, we may be able to stop them from their mission of total destruction. Join the North Carolina Heritage PAC now by visiting ncheritagepac.org. Once again, that is www.ncheritagepac.org. And help us on the front lines of North Carolina politics. The mission statement of North Carolina Heritage PAC is that the North Carolina Heritage PAC was created with the purpose of supporting diverse efforts to defend and preserve the heritage, traditions, monuments, cemeteries, flags, emblems, and other legacies of North Carolina history against those efforts to remove, deface, legislate against, alter, and otherwise corrupt or pervert their meaning, history, presentation, and standing in our state. Once again, www.ncheritagepac.org.
But anyway, you wrote a story in this issue too, didn't you, on Constitution? On the secession.
I did, and just, basically that secession is constitutional. That, in fact, it's one of the rights reserved to the states in the 10th Amendment.
Yeah, I found that very interesting, that much of our early secessionist beliefs came from the Yankee heartland.
And yet the Yankees had attempted to secede. Massachusetts, in particular, had attempted to secede several times, throughout the history of the nation during the Louisiana Purchase in particular, because they did not want to be in union with Cajuns, half-breeds, and Creoles. If that's not a racist statement, I don't know what is.
Yeah, I hear you. Well, that was a very educational article to me, because not only is the right to secession founded in our legal documentation, but it's also in our, of course, biblical past and our Christian past. And I thought it was very interesting too. Like we had this little sidebar on William Lloyd Garrison, right? And William Lloyd Garrison called for the northern states to secede from the Union. He believed was morally corrupted by slavery. And I don't know where he was. Would you remember where this happened? Was it in Massachusetts when he was tarred and feathered and dragged through the streets? You know what I'm saying? Right. So like what we hear about people, and a lot of this isn't racism or anything else. It's just like this is the culture that we have had. We're not ready to turn around and abandon it overnight. And this is what they want. And if you aren't ready to abandon it overnight, you're just a horrible racist or whatever. And then you go back, and I got this other story that kind of ties in, is like the lionization of Nelson Mandela, right? I had Arthur Kemp write a story on the Rivonia treason trial. And here we've been told, and Mandela himself before his death denied up and down that he was a member of the Communist Party, right? And they would have nothing to do with any type of terrorism or anything else. When they went to 1964, they took him, he and his communist cohorts, many of whom were Jewish. I mean, that's the fact. Nothing racist about that, but to say the fact. And it turns out he was. He was like all the documentation says he was absolutely part of the Communist Party. He was absolutely part of this massive terrorist uprising that the ANC and the other major South African communist group, right, had planned. They were going to blow things up. They were going to kill mass numbers of people. Several of the guys were like, if you look at the names, like Arthur Goldreich, Harold Volpe, you got Bernstein, Cantor, and of course they got Nelson Mandela was right in the middle of the whole thing. I thought that was very fascinating. That how they talk about you mentioned it, right? What you were going to turn on a program on the History Channel, and you're going to see that Nelson Mandela was a saint. Well, he was no saint. He had no qualms about killing thousands of innocent people, black and white, in South Africa. And how history has changed his reputation is absolutely ridiculous. Here, Arthur's got pictures of the massive amounts of bomb-making material they found, who was involved in it, hand grenades, timing devices, secret radios, connections with East Germany, Soviet Russia, right, Yugoslavia. I forget what other communist countries were involved in an absolute invasion of South Africa. Anything to by the way, that war has never stopped, right? As you point out in your story you did with an interview, you had another one when you were on your cruise and you talked to the South African gal. And so what's happened? They wanted the whites run out of their country in 1964. The Rivonia treason trial kind of put a stop to that for a small amount of time. And it's just picked up steam until they're stealing their land. And these poor people are being chased out of South Africa, these whites who've really forged that nation and made it into the most productive and democratic. Better that they would have said, okay, fine, you can have South Africa. All we want is this, 12,000 or 100,000, whatever it is, square mile homeland. So we gave the South Africans, the government gave the homelands to the blacks, right? The Zulu homeland, the Lesotho, Botswana, I think, right? Or whatever it may be. And he said, the better off it had been reversed. Just give us our homeland. Let us live in peace, and you may have the country, because the suppression of a majority by a minority in the end never works. And it was, and he makes that, he always adds and takes these older books, he resets them, he puts artwork in them, he writes forewords, he gets other prominent scholars to write for them. Great stuff. We have those books at www.barnesreview.org in the book department, but this is one I would suggest people read to get the whole story. Obviously, I'm not doing it justice. By the way, Mandela got prison for life. I mean, I guess, how did he get out of jail? I guess it changed, and all of a sudden, overnight, he became from a villain to a hero. But the truth has finally come out about him in his own books. His own books, by the way, he insisted he wasn't a member of the Communist Party and wasn't involved in this. This proves that he was involved in it to his neck.
And then the last article in the magazine was a link between the Osage Indians and the birth of the FBI.
Well, we had one of the Knights of Golden Circle, but I won't go into that just now.
I'm probably going to have Clint come on and do a whole show on that article. So
that'd be great. I will say, but there was an article about the Knights of the Golden Circle. We've covered this subject before, but the Osage Indian story is. And listen, when people we present the truth as we can find it, and if whites are villains, because we must also admit that we aren't perfect and we've made mistakes. And we also want to make the point that we will criticize ourselves and we don't hate ourselves. But when we criticize the wrong people, then they accuse us of hating them. So the point is that when you criticize us, we don't think you hate us. And when we criticize you, we don't hate you. We're just stating the facts. But when we criticize you, some reason you think that's hatred. Okay, it's not. So here's one where I thought it was fascinating. The Osage Indian, of course, were an amazing statured people. Some of them were 6'7", 6'8", 7 feet tall. And of course, they got relocated out to, a couple times they were relocated, but they ended up in Oklahoma. And they were one of the few tribes that was smart enough to sign mineral rights. Well, the FBI wasn't around at this point in time. But if you looked at the Osage, they were per capita the most richest people in the world in 1924. And why? Because of the mineral rights. They started finding that little speck of land that they were giving out there. It probably wasn't that small. But that this was like a lot of oil and gas. It might have been natural gas, whatever it was. They were pumping it out. And you see these Osage Indians, and they're riding around in the most fancy 1924 automobile. They got chauffeurs. They got big houses. They got their money is rolling in. And people started getting a little bit greedy about that. What they would do is they had head rights. I think you could inherit them, but you couldn't pass them on to somebody outside besides yourself. So you couldn't sell them. We kind of made sure that the Osage Indian couldn't have the freedom to pass this stuff on. In other words, we were the big the fathers. We were kind of like their guardians. But anyway. There was a couple very unsavory whites out there decided they were going to grab all this land. I mean, for instance, let me give you an example. An Osage Indian might have a fancy Cadillac or whatever it was back then. I don't even know I had that brand. Maybe a Pontiac would be a better one. But they'd get a flat tire. They'd replace the whole car. They just didn't know what to do with their money. But anyway, a couple of really unscrupulous people in the area started like having their relatives marry them, or they'd start giving them fire water. And all of a sudden, these Osage Indians started dying in the hundreds. And it turned out that they were being murdered. And then the rights to the mineral rights would pass on to, say, their husband, who might be a white man. And so anyway, it came to the attention of what was going on back in Washington, D.C., and this was in the early days of J. Edgar Hoover. And he started getting a little worried about it, wondering what was going on, and he would send investigators out to find out what was going on. And they say nothing's going on. Well, it turned out that they were on the take. But he finally got a couple honest guys out there. One of them came back to report what was going on. They were being poisoned. They were being shot in the back of the head, these Osage Indians. And the white investigator was like stripped, beaten nearly to death, and thrown off the train on his way back to Washington, D.C. to report on the murders. Finally, he got some control of the situation, and they actually convicted a couple of guys. But it was very interesting. I mean, nobody knows what the Osage were doing. You got a picture here of the Osage delegation meeting with President Calvin Coolidge in 1924. He's driving around in I don't know what this is, like a Model T, right? And he's got the headdress on, right? And he's driving in this fancy car But it was pretty brutal. I mean, they blew up people's Indian houses. They'd kill their husbands and wives, white, black, Indian. It didn't matter. They wanted that money. It's just a story of greed. But it's also a story that in the end, I've always felt that our people are very interested in justice. And that didn't really matter, who was, that we were going to get to the bottom of this. And it turned out it was some unscrupulous white people. Nothing to be ashamed of there, as far as the fact that that when injustice is done, and you know this, injustice is done, that we have a love for order and the rule of law. It's like when we come back to what we talked about war, unless pushed to the extreme, that we have rules of civilization that must be followed, and this is, and we don't understand that when we go into foreign countries or anything else, when we fight some savagery that we see. And believe me, we've had our own share of savagery too, dropping a nuclear bomb and all this stuff. But in the end, we still have that one thing, which is not only a strength, but one of our greatest weaknesses, which is altruistic, pathological altruism. I mean, altruism in general. Imagine what the world would be like if white people didn't have pathological altruism. I'll be criticized for that because it is our undoing, and will be our undoing, is that we have this susceptibility. Perhaps, races are different. Perhaps an ease for us to, let me put it another way. Maybe we just feel guiltier for things. Maybe we're more sensitive to this stuff. Maybe we're not. I don't know. But I do know that this was an interesting little story, and it turned out that we stuck up for the underdog. And in the end, I believe, I don't know how the Osage Indians is doing today, but at that particular point in time, the government, the United States government, which was, I guess, a little better than it is now, stuck up for these people and made sure that an end came to this injustice.
At the moment, I believe there is a special offer for subscribing to the Barnes Review. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
What you want to do really is call the office or go to the website. Call us up at 1-877-773-9077, Monday through Thursday, 9 to 5, Eastern Time. And just ask for the best offer we got going for the Barnes Review. You're going to get 6 big fat issues, right? Generally 80 pages each. That's 480 pages of material. You ain't going to find too many other places. And that's a fascinating illustrated magazine. And, of course, if you want to go cheaper, I can't give you the print books, but we can give you the PDF version of those books if you want the PDF version of the Barnes Review. Still a great buy, still going to a worthy cause, still publishing this magazine as long as we possibly can. Life, it gets tougher and tougher, as you could find out by seeing the number of publications, not only small, but tremendously large publications that are biting the dust. I understand even a well-funded and subsidized paper like the Times of Israel, right? Now, you see that story? They've been in business for 120 years? They're going all digital. Now they can't afford to put out a print publication. And of course, what always scares me, Ed, and I think you might agree, is that if we all go all digital and there is nothing physical to hold in your hand, you know as well as I do, it only takes one push of the button for all that stuff to be wiped out.
Well, wasn't that Winston's job in 1984 to go through the archives and constantly update and revise?
I need to go back and read that book a third time because there's so much in it. But yeah, you're exactly right. Yeah, go back, revise, change history, and make it fit into the ruling elite's ruling narrative. Yeah. But anyway, Barnes Review, and you write for it. You're doing this great radio shows for us. I think they're getting good listens. You have amazing guests. We have the radio station. We got the online edition. We got the website. We have our book publishing, and we have our magazine. Well, nobody knows what the future is going to hold. The battle gets tougher all the time, but we all together are kind of proud of what we do, even though we've been called many, many names, even by people on our own side, right, who allege all kinds of things about us that are unbelievable. What you read about yourself, right, not you personally, but me, what I read about myself is absolutely amazing. 25 years I've been doing this, night and day. I probably slowed down the past year after the 2 heart surgeries, right? Before that, it was 15, 16 hours a day, 7 days a week, to the point where I turned around one day and my kids were grown up practically, right? And my wife says, "Where you been for the past 10 years?" We have a lot of great writers, a lot of great people on this contributing editorial board, many of whom, their badge of honor is that they've served time in prison for writing in their home countries things that are absolutely verboten.
And now I'm going to go ahead and pull the plug there because we are literally out of time for this week's TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour. But I'd like to thank you for tuning in, encourage you to come back same time, same place next week so that we can do it again. Until then, check out our website, www.barnesreview.org, and also www.dixieheritage.net. So from all of us here at TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour, until next week, God bless.